Your eyes and your vision are under attack, damaging blue light from the sun. Your phone, your computer, your tablet, even light bulbs and car headlights is constantly bombarding you. The good news is our eyes actually already have a line of defense to counter the effects of blue light. This defense is made up of 3 pigments called carotenoids. MacuHealth with Micromicelle, the only supplement with the exclusive patent on all 3 macular carotenoids and Micromicelle technology.
Do your patients know what presbyopia is?
There are people who are afraid of the press.
Have you talked to your patients about multifocal contact lenses?
I've heard the bifocal, but not multifocal.
Exactly, not multifocal.
Do you need help with your multifocal strategy? Learn more at the conclusion of this episode. With more screen usage and indoor time, myopia, also known as nearsightedness, is increasing and getting worse in children. Now, certified eye doctors can prescribe MiSight One Day, the first and only FDA-approved soft contact lens to slow myopia progression in age-appropriate children. Visit CooperVision.com to find a Brilliant Futures certified eye doctor near you. Hello and welcome to the Open Your Eyes podcast. I'm Dr. Kerry Geld, the host of the documentary Open Your Eyes. If you're new here and you like our interviews, press like, subscribe, share, and hit the bell to get notifications of great new interviews. Also, please leave comments. Great news, you can now watch our full-length documentary, Open Your Eyes, on Amazon Prime, Apple TV, iTunes, Google Play, and YouTube Movies and Shows. And also, please share your thoughts by emailing me at drkerrygelb@gmail.com and visit my website, drkerrygelb.com. Parkinson's disease is the fastest growing neurodegenerative condition. Symptoms include loss of smell, tremors, trouble walking, and severe dry eyes. What causes this terrible, often crippling disease, and what could be done to prevent and possibly slow its progression? Today's guest, Dr. Ray Dorsey, MD, MBA, has dedicated his life's work to helping people with Parkinson's disease. Dr. Dorsey is a professor of neurology and director of the Center for Human Experimental Therapeutics at the University of Rochester Medical Center. Dr. Dorsey's research has been published in leading medical and neurology journals. Please pick up a copy of his book, Ending Parkinson's Disease. His mission, as the title of his book states, is to end Parkinson's disease. Dr. Ray, I know you like to be called Ray, so that's very kind of you. Thank you for joining me today. I really want to know, what has made you so interested in Parkinson's disease? I know you're a neurologist, so you have to be interested, but what has made you take the extra step to help people like my grandfather who passed away and my father who may have early signs of it? It's in my family. I want to know what has made you so interested in this really terrible disease.
So first of all, Kerry, thank you very much for having me on. Thank you very much for your service to the eye community and to improving our health. What's got me so interested and actually pissed off is that I think Parkinson's is preventable. I think the world's fastest growing brain disease is largely preventable. It's man-made. It's due to environmental toxins that we have in our food, water, and air. And there's no reason that the 1.2 million people with Parkinson's, the vast majority of them, need to be suffering with the debilitating disease that robs people of their independence, that today 200 Americans will be diagnosed with it, and that 100 Americans will die with it. And I think all of that's preventable, avoidable, and unnecessary. And I've made it my passion for the last 5 years to launch a campaign to help us realize that, so that we can give future generations a world where Parkinson's is increasingly rare instead of increasingly common.
So if you could go over the epidemiology of Parkinson's disease and the United States, worldwide, if you could give us some statistics, some frame of reference.
Yeah, so Parkinson's disease, as its name was implied, was described by Dr. James Parkinson, who was a 61-year-old surgeon in London, England, and he saw something new on the streets of London. He said, I'm describing something. He wrote a case series, basically profiles of 6 individuals with a new disease, with a disease that he said had not been classified in medical literature. So in his eyes, he was describing something new. He didn't say, Jones and Smith described this 50 years ago. He said, this is new. Tremors long since been described, but this disease where people are hunched over, stooped, flex at their elbows and wrists with a shaking, usually in one hand more than the other, and a shuffling gait and this propensity to walk faster and faster. This is new. And he described 6 individuals with this condition in 1817. 200 years later, the Global Burden of Disease study estimates that in 2017 that over 6 million people have Parkinson's disease. So how do you go from 6 to 6 million in 200 years? Obviously, it can't be genetics, and aging alone is insufficient to explain the rise. So it has to be something in our environment. And what's going on in 1817 London was the height of the Industrial Revolution. London's the capital, and you have the London fog, which many of your listeners know has little to do with weather and everything to do with air pollution. And the London air quality was so bad in 1817, it was 20 times worse than it is today. It was twice as bad as it was in the 1950s when any of your listeners watched The Crown. There was an episode in the TV series The Crown when Churchill's prime minister, where a smog laid down on London, killing I think 10,000 people, leading to mass hospitalizations in the first Clean Air Act. And 1800 London had air quality that's akin to what's in Delhi, India today, Beijing, China today, and akin to what many people in the Northeast United States experienced from the Canadian wildfires this summer when the skies over the Big Apple turned orange. So I think Dr. Parkinson's describing the chronic effects of high levels of toxic air pollution, and that Parkinson's disease may have been a manifestation of that disease, of that exposure.
Parkinson's is more common in men. Is that because of the occupations of men, or is it just more common in men?
I think it's because of the occupation. So most studies have found a 40% increased risk of Parkinson's disease among men relative to women, but there are exceptions to that. So there was a study done in Japan, that found equal rates of Parkinson's disease among men and women. And so I looked back, and it turned out that most Japanese farmers used to be women. And so the people working at the rice paddies who were likely exposed to pesticides were women. And so there you see equal rates of Parkinson's disease. Now, in animal models, it suggests that male mice, for example, may be more susceptible to the toxic effects of these chemicals. So there could be some biology, but I think the vast majority of it's due to sociology.
And from 1990 to 2015, the number of people with Parkinson's has doubled, 2.6 million to 6.3 million. And it's thought that by 2040, it's going to double again to close to 13 million. Now, is it more common in industrial societies where there's more pollutants and pesticides, or is it something else?
Yeah, so Dr. Gelb does his homework. He's a good doctor. So rates of Parkinson's are highest in the industrialized world. So like the United States and Canada have the highest rates of Parkinson's in the world. It's lowest in the least industrialized parts of the world, like sub-Saharan Africa. And it's increasing the most rapidly in areas of the world that are undergoing the most rapid industrialization, like India and China. In China, for example, the rates of Parkinson's adjusted for age have more than doubled in the past 25 years. So you see clear links to it, even within a region. So there was a study done in the 1980s in Canada that found that the prevalence of Parkinson's disease and the use of pesticides in rural areas of Canada had a near perfect correlation, 0.967. A perfect correlation is 1. And as you know, nothing has perfect correlation in science. Near perfect correlation between rates of pesticide use and prevalence of Parkinson's disease in rural areas of Canada. Same study has been replicated in France. Same study has been replicated in Israel. So it's clear, at least to me, that environmental toxins in our food, pesticides in our water, dry cleaning chemicals, and in our air are fueling the rise of Parkinson's disease.
And we're going to dive deep into that. I do want to ask the age group over 50 and under 50 that are diagnosed.
Yeah, so the incidence of Parkinson's disease, like lung cancer, remarkably, triples every decade beginning in your 40s. So Parkinson's disease is extraordinarily rare before age 40. And then the incidence number of new cases triples every decade. So most people are over 50 when they're diagnosed, but there are some people who are diagnosed earlier. Michael J. Fox, for example, who he himself has said that he thinks he got Parkinson's from exposure to some kind of chemical. But the disease increases with age. And I think it's not age, it's not like, you get old, you get Parkinson's disease, you get old, you get Alzheimer's disease. These are not natural consequences of aging. Parkinson's, Alzheimer's disease are not natural consequences of aging. You put a mice in the laboratory and you let it live a long life, they don't spontaneously develop Parkinson's disease. They don't spontaneously develop Alzheimer's disease. It takes time for these diseases to unfold, and that time period might be years, decades, or generations. Just like you don't smoke a cigarette and develop lung cancer the next day, it takes years of smoking and then years after the fact for the disease to become manifest. I think it's the same thing with Parkinson's disease. If we all died prematurely at age 40, few of us would ever develop Parkinson's disease because we haven't lived long enough for the disease to become manifest. But these are artificial consequences of aging, not natural consequences of aging. You could live, I think, to 70, 80 to 120 and never get Parkinson's disease, never get Alzheimer's disease if you're not exposed to these environmental toxins.
You know what I think is interesting is that Parkinson's disease is unique to humans. We don't see it in animals. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so as far as we know, this really smart guy, Dr. Bill Langston, still living, in the early 80s, he came across young people who were developing what looked like Parkinson's disease. And he's young people in their 30s. And he's like, this doesn't make sense. And not only were they young, they were developing it all of a sudden. They went one day from being normal to the next few days later to having what looked like Parkinson's. And it turned out that they were all using a street form of heroin that had been contaminated with a chemical called MPTP. And this chemical kills the dopamine producing nerve cells in Parkinson's disease. Turns out that chemical has a near identical chemical structure to a pesticide called Paraquat that's also been linked to Parkinson's disease. And he pointed out that Parkinson's disease doesn't spontaneously exist in the environment in other animals. It seems to be uniquely human. Now, in the lab, we can engineer a mice to develop Parkinson's by either manipulating their genes or getting them exposure to these toxins. But just in general, animals don't appear to just spontaneously develop Parkinson's disease. Your dog doesn't, just have a tremor, for example.
That brings up an interesting point. I understand when they want to study Parkinson's disease, they'll give animals a toxin or a fungicide called mancozeb. And that's a fungicide that they sell in Home Depots of the world to put on our vegetables and our fruit. But meanwhile, they give this to animals to induce Parkinson's to learn about it. Can you square that for me? I don't understand why they could sell it, but they use the same chemical to create Parkinson's in animals for scientists to study Parkinson's disease.
Yeah, I can explain it. These pesticides many of them are engineered to be nerve toxins. And ideally, they're to be selective for causing toxicity in just insects or just for weeds, for example. But it turns out these weed killers, for example, are associated with a 150% increased risk of Parkinson's disease. So if you look at my yard in a couple months when winter ends in upstate New York, you're going to see lots of dandelions because we don't use pesticides in our yards. And I don't think people should be using, if you don't want to get Parkinson's disease, I wouldn't be using pesticides in my lawn either. These things are not only just linked to Parkinson's disease, they're linked to cancer, they're linked to a wide range of health problems. And Rachel Carson wrote this great book called Silent Spring in 1962, which launched the environmental movement and led President Nixon, staunch Republican, to form the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970. And she wasn't railing against pesticides because, after all, pesticides had saved thousands, if not millions, of people from getting malaria during World War II. She was railing against the indiscriminate use of pesticides. So, the cost-benefit analysis for using a pesticide to prevent malaria is entirely different than the cost-benefit analysis for using a weed killer to prevent dandelions in your yard.
Peter Drucker, who's a famous doctor, said you can't manage what you can't measure. So, with heart disease, we do these labs to see if somebody's at risk for cardiovascular disease. But how do we know if somebody has Parkinson's? There's no labs to tell. How do you make the diagnosis? And Parkinson's disease is a very complicated disease. There's there's many different forms, it seems like.
Yeah, so it's difficult, and we don't have objective measures. You know, you can measure people's eyes, you can measure refractive index, you can look in the back of their eye and see lots of clues as to what's going on with the eye. But for Parkinson's disease, which historically we thought as a primarily a brain disease, it's really hard to, you know, look inside the brain. And so there aren't great biological measures of the disease. There aren't ready measures that you can have in your blood. There aren't great imaging measures. You can't just do an MRI of your brain and see if someone's got Parkinson's disease. There are some sophisticated imaging techniques, and there might be some new tests in your spinal fluid that could be coming down the road. And there might even be skin tests, all suggesting that Parkinson's disease may be more than just a brain disease. And in 2003, a really smart German pathologist named Heiko Brack, who's still living, postulated that Parkinson's disease, a brain disease, doesn't begin inside the brain, that it begins in either the nose or the gut. And it's, if you think about it, two of the earliest features of Parkinson's disease are loss of smell and constipation. The two areas of the world where our bodies become in contact with these environmental toxins are through our nose. We inhale air pollution, we inhale pesticides, we inhale dry cleaning chemicals, and we also ingest them through contaminated water, through contaminated food. We ingest it. And so it may be that Parkinson's disease begins in the gut, leading to a misfolding of a protein called alpha-synuclein. Some of your listeners know that Alzheimer's disease is due to a misfolding of a protein called amyloid, beta amyloid. Turns out Parkinson's disease may lead to a misfolding of this protein that then can spread from nerve cell to nerve cell and march up from the gut all the way to the brain. So you get early constipation and later you get tremor, or it could begin in your nose, then go back to your part of your brain for tremor. That causes tremor.
I want to talk about dopamine and the role of what does dopamine do? And then we're getting a dopamine deficiency. So if we understand what dopamine does, then we could understand the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. So talk to us about the many things that dopamine does in the body.
Yeah, so there were some great books and articles on dopamine. I'll focus a little bit more narrowly on its role in a motor circuit. So just like we have a circuit in our brain that's responsible for vision, you know, we perceive light, that light is then processed, and then we visualize it in the back part of our brain called the occipital lobe, and then we do actions based on that processing of it. There are other circuits that aren't responsible for processing light or sound, but are for controlling movements. And that circuit's called the basal ganglia. It's deep inside your brain. And one of the key parts of that circuit is an area of the brain called the substantia nigra that has these dopamine-producing nerve cells. These dopamine-producing nerve cells have huge energy requirements. They're gas-guzzling machines. If you stretch them out, they're 4 meters in length, so twice the height of a basketball player if you stretch them out. And they're not insulated, they're not covered in myelin, so they have huge energy demands. One of my colleagues said, imagine like a big garbage bag filled with jelly beans, and the jelly beans are the mitochondria, the energy producing parts of cells, and that garbage bag is these dopamine producing nerve cells. And so they're really, 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 really susceptible to injury from toxins that damage mitochondria, like pesticides, like dry cleaning chemicals. And when those circuits are disrupted or those nerve cells die off, you lose some of control of movements. And so you get this slowness of movement, you get this tremor, you get this stiffness that are the characteristic features of Parkinson's disease.
Because the role of dopamine also has to do with motivation, satisfaction, sleep, learning, cognition, and those are things that go bad as symptoms in Parkinson's disease.
Yes, and it turns out it's not just dopamine that's not just dopamine nerve cells that are damaged, or other cells that are damaged. So there are some of these dopamine producing nerve cells are in another part of the brain called the locus coeruleus, which is just Latin or Greek for the blue spot that has these dopamine producing nerve cells, and that can be involved in depression. There are circuits that are affected in sleep, and so people with Parkinson's can get sleep disturbances. There's even the retina, for example, since you have an eye audience, the retina is thinned out in individuals with Parkinson's disease. People with Parkinson's disease have troubles with bringing their eyes together, so they have trouble reading, for example. So the disease doesn't just affect one part of the brain or one part of the body, it affects multiple different regions of the brain and multiple different parts of the body, leading to a myriad of symptoms.
And is that why L-DOPA doesn't always work so perfectly? Because it's just trying to work on one part of the brain.
Yeah, so the most effective medication for Parkinson's is this medicine called levodopa or L-DOPA, and that replaces dopamine that's lost, but that's not the entire, that's not all the symptoms of the Parkinson's. For example, constipation is likely due to damage to nerve cells that are responsible for moving the gut along. And those things probably have very little to do with dopamine. And so L-DOPA doesn't treat constipation, for example.
So other neurotransmitters are affected in a negative way. Is there research to, like L-DOPA is being replaced, to replace the other neurotransmitters? And how's that going?
Yeah, it's kind of like whack-a-mole. So there are medications, the same medicines that are used to treat Alzheimer's disease can treat Parkinson's disease, dementia. And there are medicines to treat the bladder, and there are medicines to treat constipation. But you can see there's almost a futility to that approach. And that's why I want us and our community to increasingly, and the public to increasingly recognize that Parkinson's disease is preventable. Just like we live in a world largely free of polio, even though we don't have cures for polio. We live in a world where HIV is preventable. We live in a world where drinking and driving is socially unacceptable. We live in a world free of smallpox, free of typhus. We can live in a world that's largely free of Parkinson's disease if we wake up and realize that environmental toxins in our food, water, and air are contributing to this disease, and it's all preventable. We need not spend the last 15, 20 years of our life losing our independence and dying from Parkinson's disease.
I mean, you just talked about the symptoms, but can you repeat them again in maybe the order that people get it for the audience, because it's a lot of information, and maybe for people that are used to it, or God forbid have the disease. But if you don't mind just repeating from beginning to kind of end.
There's two major patterns of Parkinson's disease, perhaps. This is a paper that we written recently under review. One, it might begin in the gut. So Dr. Per Borghammer's postulated that there's a brain first versus a body first model of Parkinson's and related diseases. The gut first model begins with early constipation. Then people get early disturbances with sleep. They act out their dreams at night. They might strike their bed partner. They have early problems with their autonomic nervous systems. They get lightheaded when they stand up. We mentioned constipation. They might have significant urinary difficulties early on. Then they get symmetric Parkinsonism. So they get both sides of the body are affected with slowness of movement, stiffness, and tremor. Then later on, they get dementia and hallucinations, difficulty thinking and seeing things that aren't really there. That tends to be the worst, the more progressive course, a little bit harder to treat. The other model, Dr. Borghammer, is a brain first, or perhaps better characterized as a nose first model of Parkinson's disease, where the pathology begins in the smell centers of the brain, then marches back early to one side of the brain that affects tremor or slowness in movement. So you get asymmetric Parkinsonism, slowness, movement. Later, you get problems with depression, anxiety. Later, you get problems with sleep disturbances. Later, you get problems with constipation. Later, and much later, you get problems with dementia and hallucination.
And the scientists are really working hard to help people with Parkinson's. So after, they'll do autopsies. And what are they finding in the brain of Parkinson's as far as dopamine compared to non-Parkinson's patients?
So we've known since the 1960s or even 50s that individuals with Parkinson's have lower levels of dopamine in their brain. And that led to the development of levodopa, which is nothing more than the precursor to dopamine being developed. And it was a dramatic breakthrough and the subject of a Nobel Prize for its development. We also know that it's not just people with Parkinson's disease who have the pathology there. Is that up to like 15% of all older adults have the pathology of Parkinson's disease, but have not yet manifested the symptom by the time they die. So what we're seeing is with Parkinson's, it's likely the tip of a large iceberg. We're just seeing the people who have the clinical features of the disease, but if you actually look at everyone's brain, 10% of older adults have the pathology there, but don't have the symptoms. It's akin in eye disease, like if you look at portion of people who have cataracts, you'd find lots and lots of cataracts among older adults, but only a small portion of those cataracts does it, impair their vision sufficiently enough that they come to the attention of the eye doctor, or some people go undiagnosed with it. So it turns out that because many of us are exposed to these toxicants, that many of us are developing the pathology. Only a few of us are developing the pathology sufficient enough or early enough for it to become manifest as a disease.
MacuHealth, your science-born and tested solutions for visual performance, macular degeneration, and dry eye syndrome. New products coming soon. Embrace the science.
Yeah, we talked about the symptoms from our point of view, from the eye doctor's point of view. We'll see dry eyes. These people have trouble blinking.
Yes.
Like you talked about double vision, they have trouble because it's affecting muscles. They have trouble with, motor. They have trouble with eye movements. Some of them start having this blepharospasm where they're blinking.
Yes.
Very, unusually, and it can be very debilitating. But people do pretty good for the first 5-10 years when they've been diagnosed with Parkinson's. Talk about a little bit about the prognosis.
Yes, so it's a terrible disease. It's the 14th leading cause of death. It affects 1.2 million Americans, but early on, people can function at a really, really high level. We've had people play in NBA with Parkinson's disease. We had a astronaut, Rich Clifford, walked in space with Parkinson's disease. We've seen Michael J. Fox write 3 books and star in 2 TV series. We've seen Janet Reno be an attorney general with Parkinson's disease. We've had a senator with Parkinson's disease. We've had a congressman with Parkinson's disease. So people can function for the first 5 to 10 years, often at a really high level, if they stop getting exposure to the toxins. So organic produce, stop using pesticides, using a water filter, protect your head. If they exercise, sweat, ideally at least an hour a day, and if they use modest amounts of effective medications like levodopa, people can function at a really high level for 5 to 10 years. The problem is that as the disease progresses, more and more nerve cells die off. You need more and more medication. You get into more and more complications related to this disease.
Can you talk a little bit about the work of Carolyn Tanner and what she's done?
Yeah, so she's one of my favorites in the field. Dr. Caroline Tanner, is a Parkinson's disease specialist like me who got a PhD in epidemiology. And she's at the University of California, San Francisco. And for 40 years, Dr. Carly Tanner has documented that environmental factors are increasing our risk of Parkinson's disease. She postulated in the 1980s that industrialization was a major factor in the rise of Parkinson's disease. In the 1990s, she did twin studies. And the beauty of twin studies, before we had whole genome sequencing, lots of advances in genetics were done through studies of identical twins and fraternal twins. If something's a perfectly genetic disorder, you see high rates of concordance. Both identical twins will have it, and they'll be much more likely to share a disease than fraternal twins. But she found for Parkinson's disease that identical twins didn't necessarily both get the disease, and rates of the disease among identical twins and fraternal twins were similar, suggesting that environmental factors were the chief culprit of Parkinson's disease. She showed 10 years ago that that exposure to this weed killer Paraquat is associated with a 150% increased risk of Parkinson's disease. 10 years ago, she showed that exposure to the dry cleaning chemical trichloroethylene, TCE, really simple molecule, 6 atoms, 2 carbons, 1 hydrogen, and 3 chlorines, is associated with a 500% increased risk of Parkinson's disease. This is the same chemical that contaminated the marine-based Camp Lejeune, and that's why you get all those infomercials and commercials about Camp Lejeune, because this chemical contaminated the drinking water for the Marines from 1953, 1987, and she showed last year with her colleague, Dr. Sam Goldman, that Marines who served at Camp Lejeune had a 70% increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease compared to Marines in California who were less exposed. So she's, over the last 40 years, documented that numerous exposure to numerous environmental toxins are associated with an increased risk of Parkinson's disease, and has politely and quietly been telling us that Parkinson's disease is preventable.
And we're going to drill down into each one of those. But if you could give us a broad view of the causes. You mentioned air pollution, You just mentioned TCE, which is industrial solvent. Industrial solvent is a liquid that dissolves another substance.
Yeah.
You mentioned pesticides, genetic mutations, but there are some other ones that if you could mention.
Yeah, so we'll start with the easy ones, genetics. So we've known for over 100 years that only 15% of people with Parkinson's have a family history, meaning 85% of people with Parkinson's don't have anyone in their family affected by the disease. And we now know that only about 15% of people carry a genetic risk factor for the disease. And the most common which of these genetic risk factors alone are insufficient to cause the disease. Only half of people with the most common genetic cause of Parkinson's disease, a mutation in a gene called LARC2, go on to develop the disease. And we know that these genetic risk factors have interactions with these environmental toxins like pesticides, which might explain why some people exposed to pesticides develop the disease and why others don't. So that's genetics is like 15% of the people with Parkinson's disease. The other 85% is, I think, it's food, water, and air. And I think for people in the United States, especially, it's two chemicals. Pesticides, many of which are neurotoxins, Paraquat, for example, being the poster child of it. It's sprayed, it's a weed killer, it kills the weeds that Roundup doesn't. It's so toxic that's been used to commit homicide and suicide. The EPA says that one sip can kill. Over 50 countries, including China, have banned the chemical, but the United States has not. It's sprayed on cornfields, cotton fields, vineyards throughout the United States, including 30 minutes from where I'm sitting in upstate New York right now. Second major class are these degreasing or dry cleaning chemicals, trichloroethylene and its chemical cousin, perchloroethylene, just has one additional chlorine atom. These are the same chemicals that contaminated Woburn, Massachusetts, and led to the book and movie A Civil Action, Toms River, New Jersey, Camp Lejeune, Silicon Valley, and many, many other sites throughout the United States and around the world. And the third is air pollution, especially the little pieces of dirt and soot that we can see. So you can see smog in LA. So what you see in LA are little pieces of dirt and soot. Some of them 1/30th the width of my hair. You don't have any hair there, Dr. Gelb, but 1/30th the width of your hair. And you inhale them, and hitchhiking on those tiny pieces of dirt and soot are toxic metals like iron from brakes, lead from leaded gasoline, and platinum from catalytic converters. And those heavy metals are found in increased concentration in the brains of people with Parkinson's disease. There are other chemicals, especially heavy metals, but that's a broad view, I think, of the most relevant ones, especially in the United States.
Getting back to genetics, the alpha-synuclein gene, codes for instructions to be able to move proteins and neurotransmitters within the nerve. If you could explain what actually happens and how it misfolds. You mentioned it before a little bit, but I know for the science geeks in the audience, they'll be very interested in how it becomes Lewy bodies and the clump, that's found in the brain and other parts of the body.
All right, since you asked we'll go a little bit geeky here. But so what differentiates nerve cells from other nerve cells? The big thing is that you can't die off. So you can die off your skin cells, but you can't die off the optic nerve. You die off the optic nerve, it doesn't grow back. So makes me think that nerve cells are obligate recyclers. So they have to recycle everything. They don't have a choice to die off like a liver cell or a kidney cell. And if you're an obligate recycler, if you have to recycle all your trash and reuse it, you can't have trash build up. And it looks like these toxicants, and I can't give you the pathophysiology for how it leads to the misfolding of alpha-synuclein, but just say it leads to the misfolding of a protein. A protein, as you know, is a long chain of amino acids. Think a long necklace or a long bed sheet. And you fold that bed sheet up, you fold it nicely. But if you have a fitted sheet, it doesn't fold up really well. And so once you have something that doesn't fold up really well, it's really hard to stack and manage. And so that misfolded protein can spread from nerve cell to nerve cell, and it can't be readily degraded. Or if it is degraded, it's put into a garbage bag. And so when it's put in these garbage bags, that garbage bag is what is a Lewy body. So a Lewy body, when you look under the microscope, are within the cytoplasm, within the liquid part of the cell, are trash bags filled with this misfolded protein. And you can imagine that if you keep producing a lot of misfolded protein, producing a lot of trash, you got trash building up in your nerve cell. And if the trash builds up in your house and keeps building it up, at some point the house becomes toxic and you can't live there and it dies off. And so this misfolded protein is stored in these Lewy bodies, which are basically trash bags that are found in nerve cells that produce dopamine in the brain. It's very much akin to amyloid plaques being formed in Alzheimer's disease. Trash bags, they are not filled with alpha-synuclein, but a different protein called amyloid. And I think that's because this misfolded protein isn't easily processed, and the body loses ways for which to manage increasing levels of this toxic protein.
You know, it's very interesting. And if you can't move the neurotransmitters around and they kind of get stuck, they can send messages to other parts of the body.
And you know, having a lot of trash just might be toxic. So not only do you lose the function of the protein, but you're filling your home with a ton of trash. And if you had to walk around your kitchen without doing the dishes for a couple of days, it becomes a really difficult and unpleasant place to operate.
So tell us about the role of the vagus nerve in this. You talked about Dr. Brock before, and you know the vagus nerve is involved in this.
So Dr. Gelb, Dr. Gelb likes the science. So the vagus nerve is this really, one amazing nerve and really long nerve. So most of us know there's two major nervous systems in the body. There's a voluntary nervous system. You know, we control our voice and our hand movements and the like, and our eye movements. And then there's an autonomic nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system manages all the things that we do without our conscious control. We don't tell our gut to move a stool along its pathway. We don't control our body temperature. We don't control our heart rate. We don't control our respiratory rate within reason. And the vagus nerve is probably the most important nerve for the autonomic nervous system. And it starts in the lower part of the brain, and it has nerve projections that go to the heart to control heart rate, nerve projections go to the lung to control respiratory rate, to our blood vessels, control blood pressure, and to our gut to control movement, digestion in the gut. As I said, if we're right that these toxins are ingested and that the earliest features for some individuals of Parkinson's related conditions is misfolding of alpha-synuclein, and that alpha-synuclein can spread from nerve cell to nerve cell, what better way to get to the brain than through the vagus nerve? You hitchhike this highway that goes from your gut all the way up to the lower part of your brain, and this misfolded protein can spread from one end of the nerve cell to the other, 2 feet, perhaps 3 feet, perhaps. And then from the vagus nerve, then has a wide range of projections to higher parts of the brain. And that misfolded protein can spread from like the lower part of the brain stem to the higher part of the brain stem to the midbrain, and eventually out to the cortices. As the pathology spreads, the different parts of the brain become affected, different symptoms develop, culminating in the end stages, for example, with problems with dementia.
I mean, it makes sense, right? It's the longest nerve in the body. It makes sense, right?
Yeah, I think it makes sense, and it gets me upset because I think this is all preventable. Anyone who's been around someone with Parkinson's, your grandfather, it is not a pretty disease. And you look at Michael J. Fox, the guy is 60 years old and he can't walk the streets of New York without falling, if you've seen the recent documentary. I mean, this guy's clearly, he's almost a modern day Job. I mean, clearly this guy has been the face of the disease for 30 years. He's handled it with grace. He's handled it by dedicating his life to raising funds and research to advance our knowledge of Parkinson's disease. But it extracts a terrible toll on people with Parkinson's, a terrible toll on their family members, a terrible toll on their friends. And I think this terrible toll is preventable and needless.
We talked a little bit about that Parkinson's may be a combination of different diseases, and, we're learning about it. Talk about the movie Awakenings with Robert De Niro and Robin Williams.
Yeah, so it turned out many people know about the influenza pandemic in 1918. Shortly after the influenza pandemic in 1918, another mysterious illness broke out called the sleeping sickness. May have been due to an influenza virus, may have been a different or related virus that struck lots of people, especially young people, and caused them to become frozen in time. They developed an encephalitis, an infection in their brain, and as a later manifestation of the disease, they became to look Parkinsonian. They couldn't move. And so the movie Awakenings depicts Robin Williams as Oliver Sacks, a neurologist, and Robert De Niro is one of his patients who developed a sleeping sickness when he was a child and had become frozen, had become very Parkinsonian. We don't think he had Parkinson's from exposure to pesticides, but from a virus. And so, as I mentioned earlier, there are many different causes of Parkinson's disease or Parkinsonism. Same time this is occurring, so he's 30, 40 years old in the movie, so this would be in the 1960s. Levodopa is just being developed for Parkinson's disease, and Oliver Sacks is one of the early neurologists to experiment with it, and he's giving it to these people who have what looks like Parkinson's disease, but from a different cause. And once he figures out the right dose, they have this miraculous awakening where they're able to move again and interact and walk and talk and function at a high level. Unfortunately, for those people, as depicted in the movie, the benefits of levodopa, unlike those for traditional Parkinson's disease, were transitory, were not long lasting. And so these people had their awakening was temporary as opposed to longer enduring, as is the case for people with general Parkinson's disease.
I mean, it was really a great movie, I saw it many, many, many years ago, but it was really a great movie, and it brought awareness to this terrible disease, even though it's a little bit different, or this category of diseases. I want to talk about toxic chemicals. We're exposed to 700,000 different toxic chemicals a day. The average female is exposed to 168 different chemicals. The average male, 85 different chemicals. When we look at agricultural areas that have the highest Parkinson's disease, I think you might have mentioned Canada before, and the areas of Canada with the most environmental pesticides seem to have the most Parkinson's disease. If you could mention that again.
Yeah, so one of these pesticides are everywhere in the environment, as you indicated too. A study just came out, as reported in The Guardian, that showed 70% of pregnant women in Indiana had a weed killer in their urine. 70% of pregnant women in Indiana have a weed killer in their urine. In Canada, in the 1980s, we knew Dr. Barbeau and his colleagues showed that rates of the prevalence of Parkinson's disease had a near perfect correlation in rural areas of Canada to the rates, to the amount of pesticides used. The more you use pesticides, the higher the greater proportion of people with Parkinson's disease. The lower you use pesticides, the lower proportion of people that had Parkinson's disease. Same study has been done in France by Dr. Alexis Elbaz and colleagues. The same study, I believe, has been done in Israel and other parts of the world. We have increasingly really, really good circumstantial and experimental evidence linking pesticides to Parkinson's disease. This is a terrible disease. We're using these weed killers not to prevent people from getting malaria, but to, for often relatively trivial indications. Many of these pesticides are 60+ years old. None of us would fly in an airplane from the 1960s. Why are we using chemicals from the 1960s?
And people that work in vineyards have a greater risk of Parkinson's disease. Does that mean if you're not drinking organic wine, it could increase your risk? Have you ever thought of that? I mean,
yeah. So I'm gonna get the French wine industry after me in a second. So there's a magazine, Quai Chaussure. It's basically the Consumer Reports of France. And they did a study looking at levels of pesticides in French wines. And they found, I think they found detectable levels of pesticides in every single bottle of wine that they opened, even organic ones. Organic ones had lower levels of pesticides, sometimes in levels that were so small they couldn't be readily quantified, than in conventional wines. But vineyards from French wines have pesticides in them.
Crazy, right? So if we go through the chemicals, you talked a little bit about them, but I'm going to ask you about them a little bit again. And kind of a sequential way. DDT was kind of one of the first ones, and that's the one with Rachel Carson that was in our movie, Open Your Eyes. We talked about that, and you see them spraying it, and you make a great point that she wasn't so much against it. She wanted the pesticides to be used correctly. So, but DDT, I believe, is out. You can't use it anymore, but they still use it in Africa to prevent malaria. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, so listen, there are good reasons to use pesticides. You have lice, you want pesticides. You don't want lice in your hair. What she was arguing against, and I extend that argument, is indiscriminate use of it. So after World War II, DDT got a hero's welcome. Use of DDT after World War II, used in World War II to prevent malaria, its use increased 40 to 80 fold. There are pictures of pesticide trucks spraying DDT, and kids are following it behind it like it's an ice cream truck. DDT, and it belongs to a class of pesticides called organochlorines. These pesticides dissolve in fat. You could measure these pesticides in the fat of general populations and see them rising in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Alongside that increase in levels of those pesticides, you can see increasing numbers of people affected with Parkinson's disease and dementia with Lewy body disease. So it's quite possible that many diseases were really just extraordinarily rare or didn't exist until we had widespread use of these nerve toxins that get into our body, that are measured in our fat. As you know, your brain, all the neurons in your brain, most of them are covered with myelin, which is a fatty substance. And you can find the residues of these pesticides, this class of pesticides, in the brains of people with Parkinson's disease. We also know we can find them in milk. You can find them in the milk of nursing mothers. You can find them in cow's milk from cows who have eaten grass or other vegetation sprayed with these pesticides. You can find it in their milk, and then we drink that milk, we consume that pesticide, and then it enters our bodies.
I think it's amazing that it dissolves in fat when 60% of our brain is fat.
Exactly. So it's like a really a concern. And as you know, unlike things that dissolve in water, which you can readily pee out, you can't excrete things that dissolve in fat. The only time you excrete things in fat is when women nurse.
So let's go to Agent Orange. I think one of the most interesting thing is where Agent Orange got its name from, being stored in these orange barrels. But talk to us about Agent Orange. 4 million Vietnam vets came into contact with Agent Orange. I've had patients that have been devastated from Agent Orange, just devastated. I've been around long enough to see these Vietnam vets, and my goodness, how sick they are, and from head to toe. But if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so in Vietnam, the United States had an interest in clearing the vegetation in North Vietnam so its fighters could identify the enemy in North Vietnam, which was really hard to do when it's thick vegetation. So they developed very toxic weed killers. Each of them were named based on the color of a stripe around these 55-gallon drums in which they were stored. There was Agent Purple, Agent Orange, and the like. And they had pesticides, weed killers, in them in different combinations and in different concentrations. And studies since that time have linked Agent Orange to a wide range of health effects, Parkinson's just being a very small sliver of that. Then Congressman Tom Daschle, later Senate Majority Leader in the 1980s, introduced and passed legislation that provided some compensation and health benefits to veterans who were exposed to Agent Orange during the Vietnam War. In addition to the veterans who were exposed to it, there were obviously all the civilians and others who were exposed to it in those countries. Numerous reports from the National Academies of Medicine, National Academies of Sciences have asked for additional research to be done on Agent Orange. Much of that's never been done, or at least never been released to the public. It's worth mentioning this is not theoretical. General Colin Powell, recently passed away. He passed away with Parkinson's disease and multiple myeloma, and he did 2 tours of duty during Vietnam. And in one, he was dumping Agent Purple, a more toxic, more concentrated form of Agent Orange, into Vietnam, likely inhaling or otherwise getting exposed to the chemical. which is linked obviously to both Parkinson's disease and to multiple myeloma, two conditions that he had prior to his death.
And now Heptachlor, in Hawaii, so they were, with the tops of the pineapple.
So Dr. Gelb read my book. So all these, our book is not technical. It's written for the everyday person. They're all little stories. And then there's plenty of references to the science if you want to do a deeper dive. So heptachlor belongs to that same chemical class of pesticides like DDT, organochlorines that dissolve in fat. And it was banned in the United States. The Hawaii Pineapples Association sought to get an exemption to protect their cash crop, pineapples in Hawaii. So they let them use heptachlor to spray on pineapples. And it turned out that soon after the pineapples were harvested, they took the chop, the green leafy part at the top of a pineapple, and they fed it to cows. And they didn't wait enough time for the pesticide to degrade, and they fed it to the cows. The cows then concentrated this pesticide, which dissolves in fat, in their milk. That milk made it onto the stores in Hawaii. They found out that the milk in the stores in Hawaii had toxic levels of this pesticide, did a milk recall. Turned out Dr. Tanner and her colleagues were part of a research study completely separate, looking at the effects of aging in populations in Hawaii. And they found that people who drank high levels of milk in Hawaii had higher rates of Parkinson's disease. When they looked at the brains of those individuals after they died, they found that the areas of the brain with dopamine-producing nerve cells were damaged, and those dopamine-producing neurons were damaged. And they found the residue of heptachlor in the brains of people who were drinking high levels of milk in Hawaii. It's basically, they found the smoking gun right there in their brains.
And they were using the heptachlor because they didn't want the ants that were eating the pineapples.
Yes. So this is, again, like, not to prevent malaria, but to, kill ants. And, we don't, like I alluded to the fact that we don't drive cars from the 1960s in general, unless, for recreational purposes. We don't fly in airplanes from the 1960s. DDT was developed in the 1940s. We don't doubt the intellectual abilities of American chemists or American scientists. If we can come up with safer cars, engineers can come up with safer cars and safer airplanes, American chemists and other chemists around the world can certainly come up with safer pesticides.
So those three, DDT, Agent Orange, and heptachlor, they're outlawed now in the United States?
In the United States, yes, those are not permitted. Agent Orange was essentially just used during Vietnam in toxic levels, although its constituents, the chemicals that made it up, I think are banned in the United States, but I think some of them are still used in other parts of the world. As you can imagine, one, I'm not a toxicologist. Two, just like there's a whole cornucopia of medications to treat a wide range of conditions. There is a long list of pesticides that are used to kill all of them, and I'm not a pesticide expert.
Let's talk about some of them that are still available in the United States, that are still here and still allowed. You start off with Paraquat, that's been here since the 1950s. Yeah, so
Paraquat's a weed killer. So the United States had such great success in some people's minds about using weed killers in Vietnam. They started spraying Paraquat as part of the war on drugs on marijuana fields in Canada. And in people who've watched the movie The Big Lebowski, there's a reference to Paraquat, don't be such a quat, because they were the marijuana plant that was being grown in Mexico, making its way to Southern California, was being smoked with adverse health consequences. My understanding is that the United States was not content to spray it on marijuana fields in Canada and Mexico, did the same thing in Georgia. So the US government is spraying a toxic weed killer on civilians in Georgia who are growing marijuana plants. This pesticide, according to research conducted by Dr. Tanner, farmers who are exposed to this chemical have a 150% increased risk of research. Across the street from me, Dr. Debbie Corey-Schlecht in the late 1990s did research linking this Paraquat to Parkinson's in laboratory animals, who developed both the pathological features of Parkinson's, loss of dopamine-producing nerve cells, and the clinical features, slowness of movement in animals. And it turns out that according to research done by The Guardian and Carrie Gillum, that the chemical manufacturer knew about its risks from the 1960s, that they exposed both rabbits, rats, and mice, 3 different mammalian species, to paraquat in the 1960s, all developed either clinical or pathological features of Parkinson's disease and covered up its risk, didn't withdraw the product from the market, didn't seek to introduce a safer alternative, instead doubled down on their blockbuster product under a campaign of freedom to sell. 3 countries with the highest rates of Parkinson's disease in the world, the United States, Canada, and Argentina, were all using, until very recently, all using Paraquat. The United States still does.
And I did a podcast with Carrie Gillum, and she was in a film, and a great podcast. She's full of knowledge and she's a journalist, fantastic. Something about Paraquat, it depletes NADPH and interrupts cell metabolism, and we need NADPH or NAD plus to make glutathione, which is the body's natural detoxifier. And I know, a friend of mine called me yesterday, and she's doing NAD plus infusions, for health purposes. So if you could comment about depleting NADPH.
Yes, so I can't comment about the confusions, but it turns out Paraquat, trichloroethylene, or that many of these chemical toxins that are linked to Parkinson's disease all inhibit the function of mitochondria. Paraquat, I believe, inhibits complex 1 of the respiratory train. If you go back to your biochemistry, like everyone's long since forgotten that painful thing, that there's a Krebs cycle, that in the presence of oxygen, you got a lot of energy produced. And if you don't have oxygen, you don't get very much energy produced for every glucose molecule that you consume. And so that these mitochondrial toxins damage the mitochondria, prevent adequate energy generation from occurring in these nerve cells, which have huge energy demands. Our brain is only 3% of our body weight, but consumes 20% of our energy reserves, or energy, 20% of our energy. So they're very, very dependent on mitochondrial function. So if you have toxins in our environment, pesticides and others, that damage these energy producing parts of cells, you may be predisposing yourself to Parkinson's and related diseases.
And how about lowering the formation of glutathione?
So, glutathione's been used as a free radical scavenger, and you know more about this than I do, Dr. Gelb. People have looked at it for a wide range of conditions, and there are some indications for which glutathione has been shown to be beneficial and has not been extensively studied, to my knowledge, in Parkinson's disease, and not been shown to be a benefit, to my knowledge, in Parkinson's.
And you mentioned TCE before. Let's expand a little bit on what TCE is used, and again, it's a solvent, and a solvent is a liquid that dissolves another substance. So we have grease, we want to dissolve it. Talk a little bit about that. And it's sweet. It smells sweet. So does that mean that people go out there because it smells good, they want to keep smelling like gasoline? I remember as a little kid, I used to love the smell of gasoline.
Yes. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack. So we told Paraquat was developed in the 1950s. It turns out that trichloroethylene was developed, I think, in 1864. So just to give a little perspective, that's when Abraham Lincoln was president. This chemical was first developed, and it's been used since the 1920s. So that's about a little bit after the time of the Wright brothers launching the first airplane, and Henry Ford with the Model T. And this chemical is still used in degreasing. It's been used to decaffeinate coffee in the 1970s. So if you drank decaffeinated coffee in the 1970s or earlier, you were likely consuming this. It was found in typewriter correction fluid. So people who were sniffing typewriter correction fluid were sniffing trichloroethylene. It was found in gun cleaners, carpet cleaners, and then widely used as degreasing. If many of your listeners, remember you sprayed like an engine and it was all filled with grease, and you spray something on it, the grease melted away. Meet trichloroethylene. And so this chemical in the 1970s, 2 pounds of trichloroethylene per American, 2 pounds per American of trichloroethylene. 10 million Americans worked with the chemical. It's estimated that 1 in 12 people in England, 1 in 12 workers in England worked with trichloroethylene, printing, publishing, industrial production, refrigerants. list is long. And it's associated with a 500% risk of Parkinson's disease in humans. In mice, it reproduces the clinical and pathological features of Parkinson's disease. Like Paraquat, it damages the energy-producing parts of cells, the mitochondria. In Parkinson's disease, it was contaminated the water in Woburn, Massachusetts, living to the movie and book of Civil Action. Same thing happened in Toms River, New Jersey. Same thing happened in Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, where 1 million Marines, their dependents, and the civilians between 1953 and 1987 were exposed to toxic levels of this in their drinking water. The Marines knew about it in the latter years and did nothing. The Marines knew about it and did nothing. And because of that, people like Sergeant Jerry Insminger, his daughter developed leukemia while living on the Marine base with her father, and then died. And it led Jerry Insminger and his colleagues to launch a 26-year campaign to bring justice for the Marines who served at Camp Lejeune. So now people can get health benefits and financial benefits for the health consequences that they needlessly suffered while serving their country.
And so it also, like you mentioned, causes cancer, brain tumors. Same with Paraquat.
So Paraquat, I don't know about tumors. It causes other respiratory diseases. Trichloroethylene is known to cause cancer. According to the EPA, it's carcinogenic by all routes of exposure, so you can work with it and come in skin contact. It rarely evaporates, so it's used in dry cleaning, and so you can breathe it in. And it contaminates up to 30% of groundwater in the United States, so you can consume it. And that's what the Marines at Camp Lejeune were doing it, and the civilians there. And its health consequences is it's been associated with neural tube defects, birth defects, congenital heart disease, infertility, wide range of autoimmune disorders. As you said, you see people with Agent Orange exposure, they're just not healthy. I visited Marines in Kentucky who served at Camp Lejeune, and I was expecting to go see Marines, and they're all like, a lot of them are just unhealthy people, like men with loss of skin discoloration, with alopecia, with autoimmune disorders, just things that shouldn't be happening. Breast cancer happened among male Marines, so much so that Marines at Camp Lejeune developed a swimsuit calendar, not of model women, but of men who developed breast cancer, who all showed off their mastectomy scars from getting breast cancer while serving at Camp Lejeune.
And Paraquat, cancer, lung disease, and autism also.
Yeah, I don't know about the cancer. I'd stay, but I'll defer to you on that.
Your eyes and your vision are under attack. Damaging blue light from the sun, your phone, your computer, your tablet, even light bulbs and car headlights is constantly bombarding you. The good news is our eyes actually already have a line of defense to counter the effects of blue light. This defense is made up of 3 pigments called carotenoids. MacuHealth with Micromicelle, the only supplement with the exclusive patent on all 3 macular carotenoids and Micromicelle technology.
Fitting multifocal contact lenses presents a big opportunity to meet patient needs while growing your practice. Alcon is your partner not only with our innovative portfolio, but through e-learning. Learn to enhance your multifocal strategy today with the Alcon Experience Academy.
OIE Broadcasting is the emerging leader in social media. We use scientific entertainment to drive more patients into your office. Visit oiebroadcasting.com and sign up today.